Hello students, welcome to week 3 for COM 308. This is Dr. Romo, and with this week we're covering concepts related to listening and words and how that relates to interpersonal interactions. As we move through the course content, it's important to look at the week 3 agenda and see that we're reading chapters 4 and 5 within our course text, as well as watching some TED Talks and videos related to listening and words and language and whatnot. You're completing ICA number 2 and you have discussion board number 3 due with your original posts on Friday and your replies on Sunday. So ICA number 2 focuses on the same concepts of ICA number 1, and ICA number 1 will be graded by the end of this week. So you'll be able to have feedback prior to submitting your ICA number 2. So remember, you are observing a communication event either on television, on a video, on film, or in person, and looking at the interpersonal interactions between them. You'll then select a theory or a series of theories used in the communication event that you feel are relevant to analyzing it. This should be completed in APA format and be at least 400 words. If you have specific concepts or specific questions on that, do contact me. However, there is detailed instruction in the week 2 lecture because that's when we first introduced this assignment, and we're going to do 5 of these this semester. So it's the same exact thing as that. We're just doing a new communication event and a new theory. Remember, it is great to try to build on the theories as we cover them in class so you can analyze and look at multiple interpersonal theories throughout the semester. As you look at discussion board number 3, it's important to know that we'll be doing the Try This activity found on page 113. To do that, you'll construct a 300-word original response that answers the questions below. So the questions you need to answer are listed here. It's also on Blackboard. We're looking at cultural differences in speaking to one another and offering feedback and interacting with somebody from different cultures. Remember, your response needs to be at least 300 words and your replies need to be 150 words. As you look through the chapter, you'll see that they definitely highlight 4 different types of listening. So appreciative, what we do in these different types of listening is it ends up coming down to how attuned we are to what the content is that we are hearing. So there's an old adage that I can always hear you, but I may not be listening to you. That gets into the 4 types of listening listed in the Gamble and Gamble text. So appreciative listening is when we listen for pleasure. It's something that we're doing to be entertained. We're not really applying a lot of critical thinking to it. We're using more, if you get into the elaboration likelihood model, where you use a peripheral route and a central route. Peripheral route is where we listen to things without applying critical thinking and inquiring and making decisions, and the central route is where we use critical thinking. The appreciative route is usually we're using, appreciative listening is where we're using our peripheral route in our mind. So we're listening to be entertained. We're not attuned and concentrating and focusing solely on what that type of communication we are hearing. The comprehensive route is where we are using the central route in our brain, where we are listening very attentively. We're trying to acquire information and knowledge, and so we are listening to something like a lecture. We're listening to gain knowledge and to learn from it, so we are being very attentive and our sole focus goes towards that. The same thing with the critical and deliberative type of listening. We're listening to a debate, or we're listening to understand content and assess the reliability or validity of a message and making a critical decision or evaluation about whatever it is somebody may be seeing. It's not appreciative, it's not peripheral, where it's just out there and we can hear it in the background. We're focused and we're making decisions based on that. The empathetic model uses both the peripheral and the central route. So this is kind of a hybrid model where we use some aspects of appreciative and we use some aspects of comprehensive and then critical and deliberative. Empathetic is where we're listening as a support to build relationships with others and listening for intrinsic reward or value. So it's therapeutic. Sometimes we're there just to be a sounding board and nod our head. Sometimes we're there to acquire information. Sometimes we're there to make an evaluation. Sometimes we're there to be entertained. So the empathetic model uses multiple types of our cognitive abilities in terms of critically evaluating things or not based off of what the conversation may lead to. But the idea of this type of listening is that we're listening for support to build relationships with others and for some intrinsic reward or value. As you consider that, it's important to look at the triangle of meaning. So the triangle of meaning tells us, based off of Charles Ogen and Ivor Richards, they identify that understanding comes from within the people rather than from words they interpret. This really is a model called the triangle of meaning for better understanding of how language works and is sometimes considered theories of signs. So it's using some type of semiotic symbols meant to show the word's relationships between thoughts and things. Essentially, if we look at the triangle, the word equals a symbol or sign, the thought section equals reference or things, reference, and thing is the referent. And so when you consider that, the semantic triangle shows a direct relationship between words and thoughts and things, but uses a dotted line to represent the word sign. Is not the thing or referent. So there's no direct relation between words and things. So really what happens is that we need to, in the dotted line between words and things, have some type of prior experience and reference about the word or sign for our thought to be comprehensive. So words mean different things to different people in different situations is what the triangle of meaning tells us. So we rely to our thought to tell us, okay, this word means this in this situation, and we can associate that with this thing, and that can change over time. The word is not the thing, and there's no direction between these 2 points in the triangle. What Oden and Richards are saying is that meaning exists in thoughts, not in words or things. So if our meaning is subjective and it exists in thoughts, we need to know that we assign meaning to words or things based off of prior knowledge. So they're using some of the ideas of social constructionism given to us by Berger and Luckman that say we socially construct our reality based off of knowledge. So we communicate our reality and what we know about the word based off of the construction of knowledge is the same idea of telling us once I have a reference, prior knowledge to assess internally, cognitively in my brain, then I can assign meaning to this word and I can assign meaning to this thing. And that may change from different culture, from culture to language to situation to situation. So the triangle of meaning tells us how thought, word, and thing is all related, but it tells us that word and thing are not always closely related until we assign our thought or knowledge to it. As we look through that, it's important to consider communication accommodation theory, or CAT theory. This theory of communication was developed by Howard Giles, and it argues that when people interact, they adjust their speech and their vocal patterns and gestures to accommodate others. Really, it explores various reasons why individuals emphasize or minimize social differences between themselves and their not verbal and nonverbal interactions. The theory is really concerned with the links between language, context, and identity, and focuses both on the inner group as well as interpersonal factors that lead to accommodation. So what Giles is telling us is that we accommodate our language and our communication with others in different social settings to not just respect the social setting that we're in, but also to connect on a deeper interpersonal level with the person that we're communicating with. So essentially, language patterns are adjusted to reflect how we feel about another person. There are really 4 assumptions when it comes to this theory. And there's a lot of influence here from social psychology within the CAT theory, especially social identity theory that tells us our identity constantly changes depending on the social situation that we're in. And communication accommodation theory relies on these 4 assumptions. The first one is that speech and behavioral similarities and dissimilarities occur in all conversations. The way we perceive the speech and behaviors of another determines our evaluation of the conversation. Language and behaviors have the ability to communicate social status and group belonging between people in conversation, and norms guide the accommodation process, which varies in the degrees of appropriateness. So we look constantly for social cues and social norms to guide the accommodation process, which varies in its degree of appropriateness. So the way that people are interacting, very comically or very professional or in a very serious setting, all determines on how our language interacts with that. So if you're at a funeral or a church service or something that's very formal, or a wedding, you're going to accommodate your communication to fit that setting. When you're sitting around the table, maybe a bonfire with friends in the evening in the middle of summer, you may have a more relaxed setting, and your communication is going to be accommodated to reflect that. So some of the issues with this theory is that communication convergence or divergence either occurs. Communication convergence is when the communication matches the sender. So the receiver communicates back to the sender in a manner, they accommodate their communication to match the sender. Or communication divergence is when the communication back to the sender does not match the communication that the sender sent. So if a student comes into my office and acts very relaxed and I respond in a very formal setting and they don't innately respond, then we have communication divergence. They're not reciprocating the same type of communication and respect in communication. They're not accommodating that based off of the cues I'm sending and the messages I'm giving. If they do respond to it, then we have convergence. Our communication matches and we're in sync. As we look through this, how people perceive and evaluate conversation is through perception. So the process of attending to and interpreting messages and evaluating messages is a process of judging conversations. So as you look into that, when somebody enters a conversation, they will usually first observe what takes place and then decide how they should make adjustments to fit into that communicative experience. However, the decision about accommodation is not always necessary. Sometimes it just happens in very natural settings, and the importance of language and behaviors illustrated within the communicative setting provides indicators of social status, group behaviors, and so on, so people can innately negotiate the proper accommodation to their communication. So as you look through that, it's really important that you spend some time considering how we naturally accommodate our behavior. This is a great theory to use in your ICAs because all you're doing is looking to see how people adapt and accommodate their communication to fit the context in which they're communicating in. So if you get into an argumentative conversation with somebody, your communication goes from more relaxed and trusting to on guard and sometimes confrontational. It quickly changes. You accommodate your communication to match the situation. So it's a really interesting theory to evaluate and to look at. If you have any questions with it, let me know. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the next thing that is talked about significantly in our course content this week. And essentially, it's really used a lot in linguistics. It tells us that language reveals social reality, but states that there are certain thoughts of an individual in one language that cannot be understood by those who live in another language. And so the hypothesis tells us that the way people think is strongly affected by their native language, and the native language that they think with, they primarily speak with, and they feel is their native tongue. It can sometimes be a controversial theory, but it was developed by linguists Sapir and Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Whorf. They tell us that language is determined by the perceived reality of culture, and that language influences perception by revealing and reflecting one's worldview in all types of communication. A short history of it tells us that Sapir first discussed this in 1929 and it became popular in the 1950s. Whorf's writings came out in the 1950s after his death and told us that the hypothesis is believed by most linguists in a weak sense that language can have some small effect on thought, but in a large sense from a communicative perspective, communication theory and communication studies largely adapts this hypothesis to tell us that to look at the perceived effects communication can have, not necessarily language and what we're saying, but how culture can be influenced, communication can be influenced by culture, and how that can reveal and reflect one's personal worldview, and how your native culture can sometimes overpower all thought and perception of what we communicate with one another. There's two main points to this. It's linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism. Linguistic relativity tells us that language contains unique embedded elements, that there are structural differences between languages that are paralleled by non-linguistic cognitive differences. So the structure of the language itself is a form of cognition. The number and type of basic color words of a language determine how the subject sees the rainbow, is one example. So just the structural makeup of language in general can contain unique embedded elements of how we reflect our worldview and perceive the reality of culture to be, and what our social reality may be assumptive to be. Linguistic determinism tells us that language can shape thinking. The structure of language can have a strong influence on or determine someone's worldview. Worldview really in this sense is described as consistent and integral sense of existence, providing theoretical framework and generating, sustaining, and applying knowledge. It's what we feel our ideological perspectives are, or it's our ideology. So someone can think more intelligently about snow because their language contains more sophisticated and subtle words to distinguish various forms of snow. So we're able to, so what they're saying in linguistic determinism is that language shapes thinking, and what our language tells us and the structure of our language can help us reveal our social reality and what we know more intimately about things within our social reality. So as you look through language, it's important to keep that in mind. And so that's one thing that's discussed in the chapter this week, in addition to the cat theory. So remember, week 3, we're reading chapters 4 and 5. We're watching some TED videos and some other videos about language and listening. In addition to that, we're completing ICA number 2 and discussion board number 3. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I look forward to interacting with you, and you have a blessed week.